welcome to this breakout session on why psychological health and wellbeing at work are fundamental to sustainability and to long-term success. I'd like to invite our distinguished panel to introduce themselves. I'm going to begin with Kate.
Lovely. Thank you, Sally. Hello, everyone. I'm Kate Field. I'm Global Head of Health, Safety and Wellbeing here at BSI. Just to give you some context, I don't look after BSI's internal health, safety and wellbeing, although I support our teams that do. My focus is helping and supporting our clients to implement best practice globally.
Thank you, Kate. And Peter? Peter, on mute.
The world of Zoom. Yes, my name's Peter Kelly. I just realised I haven't done my hair, so sorry I'm playing with my hair a bit. I've been involved with BSI and 45,000 rate for a couple of years, and been in many a pub with Sally Swingwood. Hence the reason why I'm here doing this talk. Not just because of the pub, obviously. So.
Thank you, Peter. And Ivan Williams Jimenez, please.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, I'm a policy development manager at the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, and workplace mental health and well-being. Work-related psychosocial risk is one of our priority areas, as many of you could know. And also for the past few years, together with Sally and Peter and others, I've been involved as part of the ISO 45003 International Working Group.
Thank you, Ivan. And finally, myself, I am a BSI employee. I'm the committee manager for the ISO Committee on Occupational Health and Safety and also for the UK Committee. So let's make a start. Today, one of the things we're going to talk about is what is ISO 45003 and how is it relevant to this long-term success and sustainability. So, it's the first global standard on managing psychological health and promoting wellbeing at work, and it recognises that this is an issue in OHS that organisations haven't traditionally managed particularly well, if at all. And it does provide practical information and recommendations. It's not written for psychologists. I think it's really important to say that. It's written for ordinary people in organisations. The ambition being that if you manage this well, you won't need a psychologist. But we have had psychologists inputting to the development, so it is full of that expertise. It helps users identify where the risks come from, where the problems can start, and broadly that's how work is organised, social factors and the work environment itself. It gives examples of what negative impacts can look like and what you can do about it. And what we want today is to get your questions in. We have some questions on the slides, but the most important thing of all is to hear from you. Let us know what you want to know, because you're very fortunate today to have the experts. They can give you live answers to things. So let's start with, why is it such an issue? Peter, I'm going to come to you first on that.
I do apologise if the doorbell goes. I've got an Amazon delivery and I tried to get in here before 10 o'clock. So I'm apologising up front. Why is it so important? Well, if you just look globally at what's happening since we've run into this pandemic, what we'll see is that there's been a substantial increase in mental ill health. In the World Health Organization indicates about 20% increase is what we're seeing globally. If you just take our own healthcare sector, the NHS over here, 47% of all sickness absence is related to depression and anxiety. And these are psychological health issues, which, if they are managed and controlled at an organisational level, we can reduce the probability of people going off with being made sick. So it's a massive issue before the pandemic, and it's definitely a big issue now. Let's remember that just the UK data alone, 17.9 million days lost to work-related stress, depression and anxiety, 828,000 people off, and that was 1 week into the pandemic. We haven't even reported on what's going to happen during the pandemic. We could be looking at, in the region of 20 million days lost to work-related stress and possibly 1 million people off. So that increase, by the way, for the 828,000. Someone's got their computer on. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Whoever it is, we need to mute because it'll just there you go. Right. So I'll carry on. But yes. So basically, there is a problem. We had a problem before, and we've got a substantial problem going forward.
Thanks, Peter. Ivan, you said for IOSH it's a priority. Have you got anything to add to what Peter said about why it's such a priority for IOSH?
Yes, no, absolutely. Both you, Sally, and Peter were highlighting some issues, but I also like to point out to other issues that tend to be more linked to how the work is done and the work in itself. So there's always been, historically, like a lack of appropriate expertise on the topic, together with a lack of awareness from many different figures in the workplace. I would probably say a poor integration of these issues at the company level, also lack of regulations, specific regulations on the subject, and lack of appropriate tools and methods to prevent and manage these risks. And I think this is particularly important because this is what ISO 45003 really talks about, and Sally, as you mentioned, it really talks on a plain English style. So irrespectively of the size of the organization, or you do have like internal or external resources, it basically says that these are the things that you should be focusing or building on.
Thank you, Ivan. And Kate, I know that you're working directly with organisations, you're talking to people. Are organisations recognising the scale of the issue?
Yeah, so I think so. Peter touched on it. The concerns around work-related causes, particularly of mental ill health, so psychological health and safety. This has been an issue for a long time. I've been working in this profession for 20 years, and this has been an issue for as long as I've been working. When we had the World Health Organization actually define burnout as a particular issue, but without a doubt, the COVID-19 pandemic has refocused organisations, or focused actually more accurately, focus for the first time the need to really prioritise their people, really focus on looking after their people, and really look after, in particular, their mental health. So without a doubt, we are seeing a renewed focus across clients globally on this issue, and how to address both mental ill health and broader wellbeing issues, definitely.
On the slide you've got here, this is a simplified version of, why is it important, why do we need 45003? And you'll see on the slide the term psychosocial risks. And the standard ISO 45003 is about managing psychosocial risks at work. Kate, I'll stay with you for a moment. How would you simply describe for the uninitiated what a psychosocial risk is?
So I think people need to not be put off by the term. I think the word psychological and social is how psychosocial comes together. But it's really those risk factors that create a stress response within the body. That's the primary cause. And when we look at that, we talked about 45003 defines 3 areas: the way work is organised, social factors, and work environment. So it's easier if I give some practical examples. So the way the work is organised, so a really good example of this is if we aren't clear about what it's kind of the output of our work is, so how we're being judged, when it's due for delivery, that actually creates this stress response within our body. And the key thing with the stress response is that over a period of time, if that continues, it starts to cause both physical and potentially cognitive and mental ill health issues. So that's a good example around sort of how work is organised, and there are a whole range of factors all listed in 45003. If we look at social factors, so what is it about our work environment from a social point of view that can, again, particularly trigger this stress response? So really good examples here are our relationship with our peers. This would cover also things like bullying and harassment. They're the obvious ones. But actually whether we feel supported by our line managers, and often they're interconnected. So if I came back to the one I talked about in terms of how work is organised, and we look at, we've got concerns about meeting a deadline and we don't have control over that deadline. If our line manager doesn't then help us, support us, and maybe make some priorities about our workload, then actually that can have an impact as we start to feel vulnerable. And if we look at the work environment, and this is probably the area where there's the closest overlap to what we might think of traditional health and safety risks and these psychosocial risks. So if we look at the work environment and something like noise, so I'm going to give an example that's not quite work related, but to give you an indication. So if I ask you all to imagine the noise of somebody dragging their nails down a blackboard, and I'm wondering how many of you go, oh, because of that sound. Well, that reaction, is actually a stress response. And in the workplace, when we are exposed to noise like that, very high levels of noise, very continuous, or not necessarily horrible noises like that, but that response in our body is a stress response. We have it the same. So where we are exposed to high noise levels, not only is there a risk to our hearing, but actually it can create this stress response. So it's really looking at these issues and understanding particularly what it is that will create that stress response, and over time, if it's repeated or prolonged, starts to cause both physical, mental and cognitive harm.
Thanks, Kate. And Ivan, can you say something about workplace culture? We have an issue in a lot of organisations, but certainly in some sectors more than others. I'm thinking perhaps the construction industry, where there's quite a traditional macho culture. How can we begin to change the culture on this so that people do feel comfortable talking about psychological health and well-being and finding a safe space to express when they are experiencing stress?
Sally, I think it is true that we know that certain risks by themselves have the potential to bring harm to employees. And as you were mentioning, I think that most of us traditionally have been more aware of those risks in relation to the workplace culture. So we're probably talking about bullying, sexual harassment, or occupational violence. So those are psychosocial risks in itself. But when it comes to the organizational culture, there are also less visible risks that can happen over time and can really impact on workers and well-being. So here we're talking about things like leadership support, interpersonal conflict, things like job insecurity, which is quite prevalent as part of the pandemic, and many others. So I think there are also some, as you were mentioning, some cultural connotations that differ from country. I think we're quite fortunate in the UK that we have quite robust frameworks in place, but there are other countries or other cultures where this issue is still a stigma, or is everything but visible at all within workplaces. So yeah, I think that one of the things that we've been more or less preaching as part of the working group is that we really need that kind of holistic approach to the issue, and that really needs to be embedded within the business strategy and the culture.
Thanks, Ivan. Peter, you go to organisations, you work with organisations, you inspect organisations as part of your role as the HSE. Do you think this stigma is gone in the UK? I mean, we do have some legislation, and fortunately we are now talking about it. But what's your experience out on the road?
I think in some occupational areas, the stigma is disappearing and has disappeared. I still go into some very traditional male-dominated industries where there is still that stigma. But I think what the pandemic's done has been a massive leveler for mental health and health and well-being. most of the people who were confined to home, who weren't in offices or weren't in factories, would have been exposed daily to the fact that their mental health was going to be impacted by this virus. So actually, we're starting to see a seed change in people's understanding of mental health in the workplace and mental health in general. So I think now is the time, and I've talked about this quite a lot, but now's the time to really move forward the area of mental health and concentrate on breaking down these barriers that people put up, in terms of the stigma. The stigma has grown out of societal norms in most cases, and actually societal norms are changing, and people, people need to realise that mental health, people's mental health is actually good for business. If you've got a mentally healthy workforce, you have a successful business. If your people are ill, they're not productive, and then your business is impacted. So psychological health is correlated with positive business, but psychological ill health is also correlated with downturn in productivity and etc. So I think there's different ways of tackling it, but we need to go against this concept that it's not good, that we can't talk about mental health. We're doing it all the time now. Why are we not doing it in work? Sally, you're on mute. Still on mute, Sal.
I am still on mute. You're quite right. Thank you, Peter. That's one all, I think, on the muting scoreline. So, Peter, on this slide, don't worry about the bigger question, but the well-being part of it. We've had, over the last few years, pre-pandemic, lots of well-being initiatives at work. It's been a bit of a hot topic. But I want us to explore a little bit more about what it really means and what does a good wellbeing initiative in a workplace look like as opposed to a window dressing initiative. Kate?
Oh, right. Okay. So I think you're right. Wellbeing has been a trendy topic for a while, and it's really great actually that we have our first formal definition of workplace wellbeing in ISO 45001, and it talks about identifying the needs and expectations of the worker, so that they can deliver against that and meet their own personal needs in simplified terms. So it's about thinking about what those needs and expectations are of a worker. And without a doubt, when we look at wellbeing initiatives, to date, they tend to focus on the individual, but things like personal mental resilience training, what I call yoga and yoga, keeping people physically and mentally healthy. And what's been fundamentally missing is this focus on the work-related causes of in particular psychological health and safety, but actually all forms of harm within the workplace. And unless organisations address that and really think about these social factors, the way work is organised, as well as the environment, then you're always going to have limitations in terms of your workplace wellbeing. But I think one of the key things when you are looking at workplace wellbeing is you need to, and it comes back to the question about culture, and I'm going to say something fairly bold here, is that what we've seen, I think, from the pandemic is that the reality is organisations haven't trusted their workers. There's been this culture of mistrust, and wellbeing initiatives have been kind of a sticking plaster over that lack of trust. And we've seen with COVID-19, particularly the move to working remotely, hybrid, flexible, whichever terminology you want to use, has demonstrated to employers, to businesses, that they can trust their employees. But unless organisations kind of now start to look at how they continue to help and support their employees and really address the work-related causes of particularly psychological ill health, then you're going to have limited impact. The other thing is, and I'm conscious of time, is that it's really important that we start to get particularly health and safety and HR professionals to work together in this area. Quite often wellbeing has been looked after by HR, but sometimes it's just been health and safety, and often those areas don't come together. And when you look at 45,003 and nearly 3 pages that list all of these risk factors, all of these psychosocial risks, you'll see that some of them may sit more traditionally in a health and safety space, and some of them might sit more in an HR space. So unless organisations look at this really holistically and work together across functions, break down those silos, then we'll have limited impact. But again, it's got to be led, and Ivan touched on this, from leadership. That culture comes from leadership. So unless they change their behaviours and support this, then we'll always have limited impact. If you want to know more about kind of an approach to workplace wellbeing to support 45,003, then Google BSI prioritising people. Thanks, Sally.
You got your plug in there.
I could not. You gave me the opening.
Okay, we have a question in from the audience for Peter. Do you feel health and safety legislation is more aimed at accident reduction as opposed to well-being promotion?
I'm just having a bit of a cough. Yeah, absolutely, it has been. I mean, the legislation dates back to 1974. Do we need legislation on well-being? I think what we need is to do the core basics on health and safety, which is to address the hazards and then to identify that's a big word, the degree to which there is a risk there. That is covered under health and safety legislation, and it's interesting. Obviously, when we first set out in this world of well-being. It was fruit bowls, it was massages, it was a range of other things, but all of them on their own have one similarity. They were all based at the individual level. It didn't require the organisation to be an organisation that looked at it at organisational well-being, organisational resilience, organisational mindfulness. It put the onus on the individual. And in the last 5 years, before the pandemic, it's a proliferation of wellbeing initiatives. Again, all pretty much focused on making the individual do the changes. We need a seed change. 45,003 is that seed change. You need to be going into your organisations and saying, we're going to look at psychological health and well-being as one. So when we look at well-being, we're not simply going to give you a massage. We're going to think about job design, the way jobs are designed to improve people's well-being. We're going to look at environmental issues as covered in the third section of the examples that you'll see. Crowded, noisy places will lead to people getting cognitive deficits, which will potentially lead to an accident or increase the probability of them feeling overwhelmed. So I think it's logistically, I think the well-being is there. It's got a range of options. I don't see it sitting under the Health and Safety at Workers Act.
Thanks, Peter.
Not that I wouldn't mind it there.
May get there in time, and I think our audience is going to sense a theme here, that it's what we are seeking is organisational change, not individual interventions. I mean,
well, we've done it.
Stressed it so far, which is really important.
Sally, we've done it, and while we're doing all this individual resilience, mindfulness, and well-being initiatives, our data's gone up to 17.9 million. Something's not quite right, is it? If we go back to the basics of what we should be doing, which is managing at source, then we would start to see a difference. Sorry, off my Hyde Park moment.
Ivan, please.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Just in relation to the legislation question, of course, regulatory frameworks matter, and we've seen that as part of the pandemic. So, in countries regulating on the right to disconnect, regulating on remote work, but also others increasing, awareness or promoting raising awareness. So in the UK, for example, we do have the example of currently contributing to consultation on making flexible work the default. And this is basically from day one that an employee joins the work. So again, we're talking about organizational issues. But the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence will be publishing or updating their mental well-being at work guidance in March 2022. And I think this is really good guidance that applies to every single organization. So, and this is coming more from governmental bodies. So, as I was mentioning, every little helps. I know the agency has now is running a campaign called Working Minds, focusing on this particular issue as well. So, yeah, I think the conjunction of all these initiatives really help. I mean, together with other things like management standards and other initiatives.
Thanks, Ivan. And we are getting more and more resources, aren't we? So, the question on the screen at the moment is, what should we look for? How can we help? Well, let's start with all these resources that are coming out. Educate yourself, empower yourself. And somebody in the chat has mentioned the problem is that once you are stressed by one thing, you're more liable to get stressed by multiple things, as you're no longer in a good place. And tracing it back to root cause is difficult. I was going to stick with you, Ivan, for a moment. How do you think 45003 can help with that root cause analysis by actually finding out where the problem's coming from rather than dealing with the symptoms?
Yeah, I think the important thing that needs to be said is that ISO 45003 really focuses on the risk management process. So this is about having a proactive risk as a management approach to psychosocial risk. And I know that when we talk about workplace mental health and well-being, we sometimes talk about personal things. We could be talking about work-related contributing factors. So it's always difficult to discern, from those personal and non-personal issues as such. But I think the main focus of the guidance standard is about those work-related contributing factors as such. So I think that's the important thing, that or the message that is worth resonating.
Thanks. Peter, if I can come to you, Ivan touched on it. We have a lot of external stresses as well as work-related stresses. And I know that there has been conversation about the fact that, whatever's going on in your personal life, don't bring it to work. The focus of this session today is why psychological health and well-being is important for sustainability and success in your organisation. How do you see the correlation there between the external, such as the pandemic on the screen at the moment, but also any other things that are going on in people's lives, and how that affects work, and why is it important to sort of look at the whole person?
Because we look at the whole person in every other risk that we look at in a workplace. So we can take, when we go in and there's a no guarding on a machine, we don't go, well, we're not going to put the guarding on the machine because someone's got personal issues at home and they're bringing them in. We put the guarding on the machine. And so in essence, yes, people come in as humans, they come in sometimes we're going through a difficult time. Now, good management of people is you understand what your people are going through and you alter and adjust the workplace during that period of difficulty to support them, to get them through that. You are almost certainly going to be feeling distracted if you're going through a divorce, bereavement, or you've got family members at the moment who maybe had COVID. So the reality is we have to contextualize the way the world we live in and the issues that are there, and realize that in the context of work, what you can do is be a good employer and manage the people. But also you have to realize that you have limitations. You're not there as their counsellor. You're not there to be there to get them necessarily through all of the personal issues that are going at home. You can, however, give that person the opportunity to come into an environment where they're going to actually feel okay and actually get a bit of a bit of relief from the situation they find themselves in. But I'm tired of people saying to me, "Oh well, people bring them in." I don't care. People have been bringing in problems to the workforce for hundreds of years, and it hasn't stopped to managing their health and safety issue. And I know that sounds a little bit sort of there, but really, why do we go? It's that mental thing. We can't really deal with that. You know what I mean? We deal with every other risk. Can you imagine if we taken the same position on asbestosis, on fumes, on welding fumes, on silicosis, every possible health issues out there? This is the one issue where we go, yeah, but what about what's at home? Yeah, you still have a duty to try and create the best workplace for the people that you've got there.
Thank you, Peter. Kate, I want to come to you to explore a little bit more about how the pandemic has been affecting psychological health and well-being, but not just yes, we had a crisis and now it's over, we're getting back to normal. It's the long tail, isn't it? The pandemic isn't over, regardless of how we're behaving. So what do you see as the primary things that perhaps managers and colleagues should be looking out for in relation to these stresses?
So I think it's really important to reiterate that depending on where you are in the world, the pandemic is a long way from over, and even as the actual direct impact of the COVID-19 pandemic does start to ease within the work context, you're absolutely right, Sally, that the long-term implications are going to be around for months and years. So I'll give you some examples of this. So from previous pandemics and epidemics, there's a lot of research that's gone on and has shown that, for instance, people can suffer with post-traumatic stress disorder as one of the mental ill health harms that comes out of dealing with a pandemic. And post-traumatic stress disorder quite often doesn't start to become symptomatic, an actual real issue for people, until months or even years after the issue. I think the other thing is that, of course, people have been really struggling to manage during the pandemic. We've seen an increase in anxiety, depression, but what I'm also seeing now and hearing a lot from our clients is they're seeing a real increase in burnout. And I think there's, again, one of the things to understand with these psychological health and safety factors is that it's kind of accumulative. It's not just a one-off incident. It tends to build up over a period of months or years, and we're seeing this with the pandemic. People have been impacted during the pandemic, but also people have been keeping going, and actually, we can't do that for the long term, and that's where it's starting to be an issue. So organisations need to understand that they've done some great things during the pandemic, and we've seen evidence from some of our research with our clients that those organisations that looked after their people, particularly in the sort of first 12 to 18 months of the pandemic, have come out more successfully now, but it's not over. This is a long-term implication in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's still a lot of uncertainty. We're still dealing with a huge amount of change, and one of the things that is the topic of conversation, of course, is hybrid working. What is that going to look like? A lot of organisations are grappling with that, and that creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of change, which is a psychosocial risk factor for people. So the COVID-19 pandemic is continuing to have an impact and disruption that is going to have psychosocial risk implications for organisations that they need to manage. But I think, coming back to where we started, it's really important to understand, yes, the COVID-19 has kind of shone a spotlight on this issue, but it was an issue before the pandemic, and once we come out of the pandemic, it will continue to be an issue unless organisations start to address it proactively.
And Kate's reference, there's a book called The Psychology of Pandemics by Stephen Taylor. I've got it in front of me, and it very clearly states here that mental disorders can be triggered or exacerbated by pandemic-related stressors. these include people being exposed to widespread mortality, including the death of loved ones, and it goes through the history of pandemics, from the Spanish flu pandemic to Ebola and others, where you had this definitive reaction later on, and it is exactly that. We are 2 years into the first wave of the pandemic, nearly. We are in the seminal moment where PTSD is starting to surface, and that's what we're seeing across the globe as PTSD symptoms are coming up. Masses of people are leaving. Physicians who've gone through huge amounts of training are leaving the profession. And I was involved in a global summit recently, so it's it is a consequence, and this is why we talk, and I talked to Kate about this when we were at a conference last week. It is a generational problem. Over the next 10 years, we're going to have to deal with these issues.
So let's look forward and just have a think about the question on the screen for a moment while I remind our attendees, please do ask questions. We've got about 5 minutes left, so it's your last chance. Put them in chat or put them in the question and answer box. Either way will be fine. I'm keeping an eye on both of those. But let me come to Ivan first. What do you think are the key issues that organisations need to address? And also, one thing we haven't really touched on today is the very important concept of involving everybody.
Yes, I mean, as both Sally and Peter were mentioning, we are all experiencing different issues, and these tend to be like from an organizational perspective, so things in relation to trust and supervision, even like lack of sense of belonging or communication barriers. So these tend to be work-related issues. I think that one of the things that we did not touch is about that kind of inclusive exercise, to accommodate the current standard to all sizes of organizations. So I think it's important for organizations to really focus on their highest impact areas. So for a construction small business, that could be one thing in particular, and for like a big multinational that have like more resources, high impact areas, it could be a return on investment and issues, in relation to different initiatives. So I think that having that kind of like tailored approach is important, but because you are an SME and you probably need to reach to that kind of external support, doesn't mean that you cannot be doing things. So for example, as we were mentioning, cost-effective initiatives, there's already lots of awareness out there that companies can really gather, they can engage in those different initiatives and as such. So giving those small steps, I think, is something quite important.
Thank you, Ivan. I've just had a question through saying many companies are pushing to get employees back in the office and stating mental health are prolonged working from home. Is that something that you are seeing? I'm going to come to Kate on that.
So I think it's really interesting, and I suppose it kind of touches on these two questions that are on the slide as well. So I think there clearly are a lot of organisations, as I said, are looking at what the future of the workplace looks like, and for organisations that have adaptability to allow home working, I think that's here to stay. But I think there's still some challenges, some cultural issues within some workplaces where even though they've demonstrated that they can work effectively for the last 2 years, that traditional culture of you've got to be in the office, you've got to be seen, is still there, and there is sort of pressure coming through. And I'm definitely seeing organisations use culture and mental health as one area. But the who should be, and why I was coming back to this, and I'm conscious of time, is the who should be involved. So we need to ask our workers what their issues are. We might assume that that they might be struggling at home, but actually some people might be flourishing at home. So unless we involve our workforce and ask them what are the key issues for them, then we won't be addressing what is actually needed within an organisation. So for organisations that are looking at the future of work, ask their workforce about what they want, and come up with a strategy that addresses that.
Thank you, Kate. And we are 2 minutes from the next session. So I'm going to come to Peter for one sentence. Peter, what would you like to see organisations doing right now to address this topic for their long-term sustainability and success?
Do what their statutory requirements are, which is undertake risk assessments and then seek to put in measures to reduce those hazards. There you go, in one sentence. But do that with a fundamental belief that this is the right thing to do, and it's really the right thing to do now is to look after people's mental health.
Thank you, Peter. And that comes very neatly back to the BSI initiative on prioritising people. If you want sustained success, if you want to have an organisation that thrives in a world that's changing a great deal, prioritise your people. And as Kate says, listen to them, don't assume. We don't always know what everybody else wants. So with that, on the slide now is a list of some of the resources you can look at. Please do read the resources. There's plenty out there to empower all of us, whatever position we are in an organisation. And do look out for each other. Remember that time back in 2020 when we asked, how are you, and meant it? Let's go back to that. Thank you, everybody. We're out of time. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Peter. And thank you all for attending today.
Ta-ra.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
all.
Bye.